If you'll notice behind me, there's a map of Asia. And right here, we have the country of Indonesia, where my family lived and served for 6 years. And in the middle of Indonesia, right here, is an island called Bali. Now, you may know a little bit about Indonesia. Most people know that Indonesia is the largest Islamic country in the world. But the island of Bali is a Hindu island. And the culture there is completely different from the rest of the country. As a matter of fact, people would ask us sometimes, "Oh, you live in Indonesia. Is that near Bali?" Because while most of Indonesia is a very conservative Islamic location, Bali itself is where Australians come to party. Alcohol flows freely. There's a lot of pork available, something you can't eat in most of the country. Very difficult to find. Just a different culture entirely. We happened to have had a meeting there one time, and my boss suggested that we all have our hair cut to raise money for Lottie Moon. I'm going to mention that later in this video, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of context of how Bali is different from the rest of Indonesia. Welcome back. It's already the third lesson this week, and the last lesson for the week. We're going to be finishing up the second missionary journey. Hope you're ready to walk with us through the city of Corinth and see what the Apostle Paul had to do there. The city of Corinth was a further 50 miles southeast of Athens. Natural springs provided a stable source of water for the area, which is probably why people began living on this plateau, beginning at least by 3,000 years before Christ. Several different kingdoms ruled the area through the centuries, and Rome took control decisively in 146 BC. The Roman soldiers celebrated by basically burning the city down to the ground. And 100 years later, Julius Caesar decided to rebuild. Eventually, Corinth became the commercial and political capital of Achaia, which was the Roman province of Greece. Corinth was located in the center of modern Greece on an isthmus between the mainland and the Peloponnese, or the island part of Greece. And so they controlled trade. The land was fertile, so they had great agricultural markets. The raw materials for metals were also found in the area. The flesh trade was very active here, probably because of all of the other businesses in the area. But it was a thriving seaport, very wealthy city. As a commercial crossroads, Corinth became a home to almost every religious group within the Roman Empire. Commenting on the religious pluralism of the city, Robert Picarelli notes, various religions were practiced in Corinth, including adherence to the deities and cults of Greece, including Apollo, Athena, and Aphrodite. There was a sanctuary for Asclepius, the god of healing, where people came seeking recuperation and cures. The cults of Demeter, Kor, Polymaon, and others were active. The Roman imperial cult, represented by a temple that was probably built during Claudius's reign, and Judaism. Jews may have been among the original colonists, and no doubt the Jewish population was swelled by edicts in AD 19 and in AD 40, expelling Jews from Rome temporarily. Here is an artist's rendition of what Corinth, Greece would have looked like in the time of Paul. The city's architecture would have included many porches where there were public gatherings, a bema seat where court decisions would be announced, public baths and fountains, an amphitheater and other buildings. It was a very large city. Here's a photograph of what Corinth looks like today. This is Corinth, Mississippi. So let's get into the text and see what we can learn from Paul's experience in Corinth, the one in Greece, beginning with verses 18, 1 through 6. As we discussed, in Paul's days, travelers would have found housing with people in the same trade, and so it is when Paul arrives in Corinth, he makes arrangements to stay with a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. They came because Claudius, the emperor, ordered all of the Jews out of Rome. It said by Emil Scheurer in his History of the Jews that the Jews were constantly making disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus. Does this refer to Jesus, the messianic hope of the Jews in general? Or was there some other person named Chrestus? We really aren't sure. But in any case, Aquila and Priscilla are living in Corinth, and they welcome Paul and the team into their home. They were of the same trade. They were tent makers. That word just means literally leather workers. And probably they were making some kind of awnings out of linen that were then used to keep the sun off of people. It may have been tent like we know, or it may have just been an awning off of the side of a building
probably more like a patio today, but they were working together and sharing that same trade, and so Priscilla and Aquila invited them to come and to stay in their home. The ministry here in Corinth begins according to the usual pattern. They start in the synagogue, they make some progress, they get opposition from the Jews, they decide to work only with the Gentiles. So we've seen this pattern over and over everywhere that Paul goes. Remember that as strong as Paul's protestation is, it is not an absolute. He says that the blood will be on their own heads and that from now on I will go to the Gentiles. But even having said that, we're going to see that he's continuing to work with the Jews. But what he means is, rather than staying there within the synagogue itself, he's going to move on and have a Gentile-focused presentation. But even when he's in the synagogue, he's leading Greeks to faith. And even when he's working with the Gentiles, he's still leading Jews to faith. There is one difference, or at least one note we haven't seen before here in the pattern with what Paul is doing. And that is that while Paul begins by raising support through his work, the tent-making work, later he says, after Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, that he is able to devote himself completely to the word. This is a new work for Paul. The indication is that perhaps when they came from Macedonia, from Philippi, they brought money. And so Paul didn't have to work anymore. It wasn't that he thought it was more noble to work. He was just willing to work. But we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 8 and 9, Paul says, "When I was present with you, the Corinthian church, and I was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. When the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. And in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you." He goes on and tells the church in Philippi in chapter 4, verse 15, "You yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel after I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone." So these two passages make it seem likely that when Silas and Timothy joined Paul there in Corinth, they brought a large contribution from the church in Philippi that made it possible for Paul to stop making tents and to focus exclusively on the gospel ministry. So, picking up the story in Acts chapter 18, verses 7 through 11, Paul has told the Jews that he is through with them, that their blood is on their own head, and he's going to set up a new home of operation. It's going to be in the home of a man named Titus Justus, who was a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. So he didn't go very far. Perhaps the synagogue was centrally located, or everybody knew to go there to find Paul, to be a part of the training that was there. Crispus, who was the leader of the synagogue, has now become a follower in Christ, and he has come along with Titus Justus, with Paul, to the new work. Besides Crispus, many have responded to the gospel, and they are baptized. Literally, they are immersed in water as a sign of their following in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. In the midst of this great outpouring of numerical success, Paul has a vision from the Lord. Perhaps it was a dream, because it says Paul in the night by a vision, or perhaps it was a vision. But at some point in this experience, Paul sees the Lord telling him, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you." The pattern at this point has been Paul moving on when the persecution begins. But here the Lord is calling him to stay in Corinth, which he does. He ends up spending an entire year and a half. He spends a year and 6 months or 18 months there in Corinth, perhaps because the Lord has called him to be bold and not to move on in spite of the persecution. When the Lord in the vision tells him, "I am with you," that's the same language that is often used in the Old Testament to indicate the presence of Yahweh, of his active presence giving victory. So surely, for an Old Testament scholar like Paul, this was great encouragement. And so Paul stays there in Corinth for a year and a half in spite of the opposition that comes against him. During those 18 months, not only did he continue to do his ministry there, he wrote the first two epistles that we have in the Bible. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were written while Paul was staying in Corinth. Moving on with the story, the persecution continues just as it has. We're continuing to follow the same pattern that we saw in Thessalonica, the same pattern that we saw in Philippi, and that is that the Jews are going to be upset and they're going to bring Paul to trial. And so they bring him before the proconsul Gallio, and they charge him with leading people to worship in a way that is not approved by the law. They're saying he's a threat to the Pax Romana, the peace throughout the Roman Empire that's held by not letting people preach religions that aren't accepted by the government or might be a threat to the Caesar. These are the same charges again. They got Paul kicked out of Thessalonica. They got Paul kicked out of Philippi. But what happens here is that Gallio, I love this, Gallio says to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or vicious crime, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names in your own law, look after it yourselves. I'm unwilling to be a judge of these matters. So he doesn't care. Gallio is a person of influence who gives his protection to Paul. And this is very significant because in the other places, the government sided with the Jews against the preaching of the gospel. And that was in their locality. That was in their town. But here we have Gallio, who is the proconsul for all of Achaia, which means all of Greece. The entire province now has permission for the gospel to be spread. So he's become something of a sponsor to the team here. It's possible that this was a fulfillment of Jesus' promise in the vision. The Lord had people of influence in the city who would protect Paul and his gospel ministry. So the end result of this attempt to ban the gospel was the gospel being given government protection not only in the city of Corinth, but throughout the entire region of Achaia, or the entire region of Greece. And as a result of this decision, the Jews turned on Sosthenes and beat him up. Presumably, Sosthenes is the one who took Crispus's place as the head of the synagogue after Crispus became a follower of Jesus. So this next point is maybe just supposition, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 1, when Paul writes back to this church in Corinth, two people are writing the letter of 1 Corinthians. Paul, called as an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. Now, certainly there could have been more than one person named Sosthenes, but as Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, it seems to be that this is a Sosthenes who is known by the church at Corinth. So it's possible that this synagogue ruler also became a Christian the same way that Crispus had. Finally, it's time to leave Corinth and bring the second missionary journey to an end. Paul heads out to sea, bringing with him Priscilla and Aquila, and then leaving them in Ephesus, promising to return if it is God's will. Remember, Paul's custom throughout the book of Acts has been to pick up and drop off disciples as he goes from place to place, spending time training them, pouring life into them, and then letting them represent him and represent the gospel in new locations. So he doesn't spend much time in Ephesus, but he says he's going to come back, and that's what we're going to see when we get to the third missionary journey. The bulk of the text of the book of Acts referring to the third missionary journey is going to be about what happens in Ephesus. As Paul is going back, setting sail from Ephesus, he lands in Caesarea, but before getting there, he stops in Cenchrea and has his hair cut because he was keeping a vow. What was that vow? Some commentators assume that Paul was making a Nazirite vow, and that's why he cut his hair. It was perhaps a free will thanksgiving to the Lord for the protection Paul received in Corinth. Perhaps it was an attempt to identify with the Jewish community to whom he was returning. Maybe Paul was following a Greek practice, and he was wanting to adapt it for Christian purposes. We really don't know. We only know that he had his hair cut, and that was in result of keeping a vow. Once when we were at a meeting in Bali, our leadership team auctioned off their hair for a Lottie Moon offering. When I got back from that meeting, my neighbors all assumed I had gone to Bali and made a religious vow, which was a common practice on the island. That's not exactly what happened, and I don't think that's what happened with Paul either. So with that, Paul returns to Antioch and brings the second missionary journey to a close. Next week, we're going to join him for the third missionary journey beginning in Ephesus. But in the meantime, I want you to take the opportunity to review the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians along with the assigned videos. The links are there on the site in Moodle. I hope you enjoy that, and you're starting to put together all that God is doing through the Apostle Paul and what he's teaching the church about how to do missions. Enjoy watching those little videos, and I look forward to talking with you next week. God bless. So, the Apostle Paul went to an area that was known for sexual immorality, for a lot of wild living, parties, people coming in from all over the world on vacation, so to speak, and he came back having his hair cut. Now, why do you suppose he did that? We talked about it a little bit in the video, but in this book, Paul the Apostle, by Robert Piccirilli, he mentions a question might be raised about the appropriateness of Paul's taking part in such a Jewish practice as the Nazirite vow. As we have seen, Paul's rule was believing Jews still lived as Jews, whereas believing Gentiles should not do so. As we continue to struggle with or try to understand completely Paul's teachings on the concept of contextualization, it's important for us to remember that what is appropriate for one context is not appropriate for another context. That's the whole point of contextualization. And so when we make adaptations to introduce the gospel to a new people group, that shouldn't make us try to force those changes on the existing church
that is already adapted to meet the culture where it is. Just a little bit of food for thought as we continue to study through the life of the Apostle Paul.